I'm going to start that. And Michael, I don't know if you want to make an introduction or.
Oh, that's just fine. You want me to introduce myself? I am Dr. Michael Booker. I teach history up at Ames Community College in Greeley, Colorado. I am excited to be here, mainly because my area expertise and specialization is modern Britain with a focus on Northern Ireland, specifically the Protestant community.
Okay. I'll let you, since you're moderating, I'll let you give instructions.
Oh, all right. So what I have been told is we don't have a lot of time, but what I have been told is that we want to give about 3 to 5 minutes per question and then allow for some student questions toward the end. So if let's go ahead and introduce our two panelists. Jon, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, Jon McCourt, and again, it's about timing. It's about the time that we have. I worked in reconciliation for over 40 years. Before that, I was a member of the Irish Republican Army. I was actively engaged in the conflict in the north of Ireland for 7 years. I buried a lot of friends. I saw a lot of other people die. I saw a third of the commercial heart of the city that I live in blown apart by the organization I was a part of. I saw 70, 80% of the Protestant population on the west bank of the river move out and move to the other side of the river. And I was there on Bloody Sunday. And I was in the middle of what happened on Bloody Sunday. And it was just after Bloody Sunday, I started asking myself a question: is this where we started? If we started looking for votes, for equality and representation, we started looking for equality in housing, we started looking for equality in employment. And this is where we end up with our people dying on the street. And at that point, you know, I was still actively engaged in the conflict. And I spent the next 4 or 5 years just trying to figure out, was there another way we could do this? And by 1976, I got really sick. I ended up in hospital because I couldn't end up in hospital in the north. I would have been arrested. I ended up in hospital in Galway. And it gave me some time to think. And fortunately, and I say fortunately, that by the time we got to 1976, the leadership of the Republican movement was now no longer in the hands of people who'd been there in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s. These were people who were my age, people who I grew up with, people I fought alongside, people I trusted and I hoped trusted me. And a couple of people came down. One came from Belfast, a couple of people came from Derry to talk to me about this new direction I was thinking about taking. And I said to them, look, this is not about stopping a war. Our job is not to stop a war. Our job is to, you know, what I'm thinking we should be doing is changing the condition on the ground that makes war a first option. That's what I'm going to do. And the deal we left with, and I was still in the hospital, was when I came back to Derry, I wouldn't step on their toes, they wouldn't step on mine, and we'd find a way of accommodating each other as we tried to find a new direction that would take us beyond that, beyond the conflict. And as I said, you know, I spent I got back to Derry in 1978, and I've spent every day from 1978 doing exactly what I set out to do.
Good. Brilliant. How about you, Martin?
My experience here is I was, most of you are not old enough to remember, but in the 1990s, there was quite a bit of violence in Israel and Palestine. And I went there to do a study abroad, and I ended up staying. And it was quite violent. I mean, there was, near daily buses blowing up in restaurants, and it was maddening. And I actually owned a bar, so it was a concern for us. One day, I was actually meeting with a friend, and we were talking about opening a new bar. We were walking down the street, and fortunately we stopped at the red light. Had we not, I wouldn't be here. So there was a suicide bomber who he tried to get into a mall, and then they turned him away, and then he just waited till he got to the crosswalk and blew himself up. Knocked me on my butt, and I made it. And it was interesting because friends and family asked me afterwards, like, why aren't you angry about this? Most people are, have an angry reaction, want revenge, whatever. And I'm like, no, I should back up and tell you that I originally went to Israel for a study abroad to study international security, and then ended up opening a bar. But that's another story. And so it reminded me that that's what I wanted to do. And so for me, I just wanted to understand why did you try to kill me? So I ended up going back to school. I'll skip the long bit of it. I'll just say after graduating from my master's program, I went back to Jerusalem, and I worked for a group called Search for Common Ground. And Search for Common Ground works on the grassroots level with just people and local community leaders and organizations, but it also works back channel. Prior to even going to Israel, but prior to that, I had worked at the UN, so I had some government to government experience in mediating. And so, I started engaging in the mediation process. We reached an agreement between Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians for an emergency response apparatus. And yeah, I've just kind of dedicated, ever since that incident, I've dedicated myself to trying to find a resolution to this conflict. Oh, and I'm sorry, one more thing. And then unrelated to this, so I did go, while I was doing my PhD, I came back and was doing my PhD. I worked for the Center for Terrorism and Intelligence Studies, which we also looked at these sort of things.
Before I get into the meat of the questions, I'm actually interested to know, and this is a question for both of you, if your path toward peace and reconciliation was in any way inspired by the events that happened in the United States in the 1960s. I'm particularly talking about the civil rights movement and the approach of Martin Luther King in places like the Deep South, like where I am from in Alabama.
Gotcha. I remember, I actually remembered because I was there on the 5th of October, 1968, when the first Civil Rights March took place in Derry. And a lot of the discussion that had taken place before that was about non-violent protest that was going to create enough pressure to create the change that would inevitably move us forward. Our difficulty then was that the state weren't prepared to give. And there's absolutely no doubt in that. The state were not prepared to give. And non-violent protest sounds great if you're somebody who understands the politics of a place, if you're somebody who understands, how the dynamic of conflict is going to work and how government works. I was 17 years of age. Somebody's talking to me about non-violent protest going to make change in a situation where I could not become politically involved because I was disenfranchised and enabled to make the change that needed to be made, as were most of my people. And when they talked about civil rights and they talked about nonviolent protest, they talked about Martin Luther King, and they talked about Mahatma Gandhi, and they talked about Jesus, and it all sounds great when when these people with the experience and the knowledge and the international sort of kudos that actually say, look, this is going to work. And then suddenly you're launched on by the police and beaten off the street. And I remember actually thinking, one of the things that they'd actually said was, just remember Jesus and turn the other cheek. When you're sitting on the street and your all arms are linked together and you're determined to hold your ground, and a cop comes over and hits you in the side of the head with a baton, you can turn the other cheek. He's going to hit you there too. And when he hits you there, you've got nothing left to turn. You've got a choice. You're either going to lie down, you're going to stand up. And on the 5th of October 1968, I stood up, and I've been standing up ever since.
Thank you. What do you think, Martin?
As for me, I would say, first of all, fortunately, I'm not old enough to have, I actually experienced maybe the end of it, but I wasn't old enough to understand. How much of the civil rights movement or any nonviolent movement, you know, kind of like Jon says, it's difficult when you're in the midst of it. I did join the peace movement. I have always been, and I am still consider myself a two-state solution person, although that's looking further and further away. But I am still committed to a two-state solution. But yeah, I mean, when I have to agree with Jon, when you're in the midst of it, and when, you know, bombs are going off and things are, it's hard. It's hard, and it was hard to, and I did participate in rallies in Israel. I'm sorry, it's not that, I would say more than half the population at that time, more than half the population agreed with us. But there wasn't terrible excitement about it. There wasn't, you know, so there wasn't the such a strong feeling of solidarity. Yeah.
Well, I think that, you know, especially given the circumstances that you've both been in, and the fact that some of our students don't know the background of what was going on in Israel, Palestine, Jerusalem in general in the 1990s, what was going on in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in Northern Ireland. Can y'all give us just a brief overview of, you know, what led to these conflicts? Just, and I know that that's an amazingly huge question in both of these circumstances, because both of these circumstances are incredibly, you know, complex.
Let me make it very brief. So let's go back to the Roman Empire.
You go back further than I can go back. I can only go back 800 years.
So I mean, to briefly describe the conflict, though, you go back to the Roman Empire, and the Jews got kicked out in 70 AD or CE or whatever you want to call it, and the Jews were spread all over the world, mostly in Europe, and faced discrimination and violence in Europe, and, you know, put up with this for a long time until finally it got bad in Russia in particular, and there was a couple of philosophers, and the one important one is Theodor Herzl, who wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, which is basically Jewish state. And if you read it, it's a plan of how you create a state. And then there was various events that happened in Europe, including the Holocaust, of course. And there was a mass influx of Jews to the land of Palestine. And this naturally put in a conflict. It's a conflict between they're both secular movements. They're both nationalist. They both have used terrorism, violence, as a means to achieve their ends. But it's essentially about land, and uncompromising, mostly uncompromising positions on land. Just can't occupy the same space. And that really goes back to the nationalism. So at the heart of this conflict it's a nationalist conflict.
This is really interesting because claiming space is obviously in Northern Ireland, and has long been, since the 1500s, an issue between those who came from Britain, from Wales, from Scotland, from England, and settled during that period. It continues to be an issue today, especially as we, you know, lead into the marching season after the Loyalist marching season after Easter. What say you, Jon?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to 1169 and the first involvement of the English or the Normans in Ireland. You know, I do a lot of work with a lot of students when they come here and they're doing their study abroad. And a lot of them ask me the question, but John, when did it start, you know? And some will say it started on the 5th of October, 1968, and some will say it started in 1922 with partition, and some will say it started in 1690 after the Battle of the Boyne. And the honest truth is it actually starts in 1169, when the two really massive clans in the very south of Ireland had a dispute again over land and territory, and one of the clan chiefs died, and now we want the land because like we're a bigger army, and they get in touch with the English, and Henry III decides to get in touch with his friend, who's the only English pope that we've ever had, who then blesses the Normans to come to Ireland to help settle the dispute on behalf of the Fitzgeralds. The Normans arrive in Ireland, they build castles all around the place, and suddenly the Normans decide, you know what, these Irish aren't really that bad. This isn't our fight. A lot of them become more Irish than the Irish, and the English don't like this. So we spend the next 500 years deciding what we do, and the Irish have this thing about, you know, if a clan chief dies and we want his land, we're going to fight him, whoever kills the most people wants the land. And then we get this tiny wee part of this big island, to me, a big island. It's not that big, really, you know. And I really, you know, I mean, talk about mediation and a way to resolve a problem without violence. This is how you do it. Guys, look, let's not just kill one another. Here's the deal. Why don't we just have a race, a boat race? And we'll decide whoever first sets their hand on the land of Ulster will win it. And off they go from a mile offshore and they're rowing ashore. And the O'Neill decides, I could lose this race. But the deal was whoever first laid hand on Ulster would win it. So he cuts off his hand, he throws it on the land, he wins the land, you know, and thousands of people are slaughtered in the process of this. And that's how we have the red hand of Ulster. And part of that's about symbolism. And we look at the symbolism of that. And we look at what this conflict has actually done. You know, you take the involvement of the English, you take James's collapsed regime in the 1680s. He goes off to France, he recruits a mercenary army, decides he's going to ride back, he's going to take his throne back now from this Dutchman, who's his father-in-law and his uncle at the same time. Look, internecine disputes are not new things with the English, okay? And so James decides, rather than arrive in England with a small army and this tiny fortune, I'm going to arrive in Ireland, I'm going to recruit the native Irish, because they'd rather have me as a Catholic king on the English throne than a Protestant Dutchman. And suddenly, arriving in Kinsale, fear starts breaking out among the Protestant population in the southern part of Ireland, because they still have a living memory of the 1641 rising, where tens of thousands of Protestants were butchered. And they start fleeing ahead of James, is now advancing and recruiting army. They get through Enniskillen. After Enniskillen falls, there's one place they can come to, the place I love, Derry, a city built by a plantation. You know, for 2,500 people, defendable walls, a cathedral that's been built there. It meets all of the criteria for this new city. And 20,000 people arrive in Derry. James's army of 30,000 people surround the place, bombard it from August right through until April. James arrives himself thinking, I'm the king. I'm going to turn up at the gates and they're going to let me in. Didn't happen. His master of his guard was killed. James flees off up to the top of the hill and says, destroy the city. And in the midst of all of this, over half of the people that had come to the city for safety died. And you talked about the marching season, you know, and that leads us into a very interesting conversation around the celebration of culture. And I've never had an issue with the Protestant population in the city or in the north celebrating their culture. They're entitled to do that. The thing is that when they're doing it at the expense of the people who actually live here, when they do it at the limitation of the freedom of the people who actually live here, then we have a problem. So we have to sit down, we have to talk our way through this. And I haven't even touched on like the roots of the modern conflict and gone beyond that. But there was a point in 1996 where the city was literally burning to the ground. 3 people had been killed, over 6 million people, £6 million worth of damage had been caused in 2 days. And this former member of the Irish Republican Army goes, knocks on the door of the apprentice boys of Derry and asks to speak to the governor. And he opened the door, and a couple of years later, when I brought a group of students in to talk to him, he told me the story. He opened the door and he remembered me. I'm 6'6" tall. He remembered me standing on the street in the Bogside with a Thompson submachine gun in my hand, stopping his van as he was bringing deliveries in, and actually getting somebody to escort him in his van to deliver bread around the neighbourhood that we had closed off in 1969. And he said he was so tempted at a point to slam that door in my face, and he decided against it. Alistair Simpson and I are the greatest of friends as a result of the conversation we had then. And it's about moving beyond the place where you decide the hate and the history are going to stand in the way. Let's see what the guy has to say, and we can't do that if we're going to start shouting across barricades with one another. We need to be sitting in a room. And I mean, the whole discussion around the two-state solution is something I understand. I remember following it as it was happening and saying this could only have happened because people got in a room, not because they were firing shots at one another from either side of a barricade. And I've said this for years, and any student who's ever been here and any student who will ever come here will remember me saying this. There's one thing you have to remember, is that the force of argument is greater than the argument of force. You are not going to change stuff by force. You're going to change stuff by argument. The Good Friday Agreement was about it. The Windsor Agreement was about it. Look, I don't know how we're going to get out of this protocol issue right now, but everything that we've set up to now that has worked has happened because enemies went and sat in a room and we decided that the force of argument was greater than the argument of force. You need to be persuaded. You don't need to be pushed.
Jon, I'm going to indulge myself and go ahead and ask you a question that I came up with just because we've mentioned marching, and marching on, especially on the Loyalist side, has contributed directly to marked conflict, and it's something that I myself have witnessed. I have been to several both rural and urban Loyalist marches in Glasgow, Belfast, and around the north. But my question directly for you is, do you think this issue of Loyalist parading, of Loyalist marching through the summer months, do you think that contributes to a continuation of the tribal rigidity that we see between the two communities?
Again, it's about seeking accommodation as to how we march. It's about seeking accommodation as to what rights we're going to respect or what rights we're going to deny in the process of doing this. It's about working within the legislation that currently exists and marching. And a consideration for the people in whose territory, and that's an awful way to look at it, because we're a small island and we only have like 2 million people here. We're not talking about like we're stepping on the toes of 100 million people. But every time a march takes place down the street that 50 years ago belonged to a community and now no longer belongs to that community, there has to be an accommodation reached. And the accommodation isn't around marching. The accommodation isn't around the music that they play. The accommodation is around the respect for the people who live there now. It's also about, on the opposite side, a respect for the identity and the culture of the people who want to celebrate or commemorate a particular event. And, when we look at it that way, we start looking at it different. We're not looking at the bands. We're not looking at the colors. We're not looking at, at the things that we would say here, get your heckles up. What we're looking at is the right of someone to celebrate or commemorate a particular event in history that means something to them. And I know my community have certainly, the nationalist community have reached out and said, look, we're prepared to accept the fact that this is something that means a lot to you. All we're saying is, if you're going to celebrate it in a way that doesn't infringe on our right to be citizens in this country. And that's where the discussion that led to the end of the marching problems in Derry came from, was a discussion between myself and Alistair Simpson, the governor of the Apprentice Boys, a former member of the IRA and a former B Special and a former member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, who sat in a room and said, John, I know where you're coming from. Tell me, what can we do? And it was an interesting question the way he put it to me, because I had the exact same question in 1994, early in 1994, before the IRA ceasefire, from the commander of land forces in the north of Ireland, who actually sat at the top of a table with 3 or 4 of his officers beside him, and who said to me, Mr. McCourt, just tell me. And this is where I think this has to be the first question people ask when we're talking about reaching an accommodation. What do we need to do to get you to where you need to be? And that's more or less what Alistair Simpson said to me, and that's exactly what the commander of land forces, in other words, the army officer responsible for every soldier in the north, turns around and asks a former member of the Irish Republican Army, tell me, what do we need to do?
That is probably,
for me, it's about.
I'm sorry, John, that was
For
probably
me,
the most delicious answer I've ever heard to that question. No,
for me, it was about respect my position. I will respect yours. Don't infringe on my rights. You have a legal right to be here. You do not have moral authority over my people. Let's find a way that we can work all of this so that you understand that everything that you do impacts not just on my people, but on your people back home. And I said to him, I'm recognizing the fact that your men have died, that your soldiers have died. And a lot of them have died because they've just been sent here, not because of any political agenda. They're numbers on a book. They're numbers, their names on a memorial. And that's the sad thing about it. It's because we don't get the opportunity to personalize this conflict and understand the toll. And I think one of the things that I've looked at over the years, and I remember it was a guy became a very, very good friend of mine, a Catholic priest, who brought together myself, another former internee, and a Church of Ireland minister. And the Church of Ireland minister brought with him 2 people. One whose son had been shot by the IRA, and one whose mother had been killed in a bomb. And you sit and you listen to those people talk about the impact of a conflict. And this is what we lose when we just talk about numbers. And you realize at a point, you know what? Much as we would love to believe it because it justifies our position, we do not have a monopoly in the suffering of this conflict. And I think once we realize that, we're able to look outside of the things that have boxed us in, what we're going to lose, and you start looking at what can we gain. And what can everybody gain from this?
Thank you, John. Like I say, that's one of the best answers to that question that I've ever heard. I think that I could sit down at a pub and talk to you probably for days on end, to be honest with you. This is a really rich conversation. I want to go, I've got a couple of other questions. I know we're starting to run shorter on time. John's hit on this just a little bit, but I want to direct this first to Martin. When it comes to the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians, what does resolution to the peace building process look like? And once again, this is a massive question. First, I want to obviously ask Martin, and then I'll defer to John.
It's a hard question to answer today. The negotiated peace agreement is on paper. It's been done. It just needs signatures. And that resolution divides the territory. It's a 2-state solution. There's actually cooperation on security in other areas. I think Jon said, two things that Jon said just now that I thought were just so fitting. The force of argument is the first one. And the second one is really, I'm paraphrasing here, Jon, but what can we do to get you where you need to be? And I think that that's the real challenge. And, I wrote a chapter for a book on the Camp David Accords, and it really just gets into the nitty gritty of all this negotiation and mediation. And that's where I really first to start to realize, like, oh, there really is a solution here, and it's achievable. There are complicated areas such as Jerusalem, just going to be complicated. But there is a solution. It is on paper. And again, awaiting signatures. The problem right now, sorry, but I'm more pessimistic than I've been in a long time about something positive coming, because you've got a right-wing Israeli government, a coalition that is made up of parties who have no interest in dealing with the Palestinians. Their attitude is, well, we've tried, and we're done. And so now we're just going to take over their land. And that's really the difficult part for me, because it's out of reach. Okay. The more and more Jewish settlements are built, the more and more difficult it will be to untie this. And so that's been really, disheartening for me as somebody who really worked towards this and saw a future. I could see it. What was really sad is, so I've lived there on and off since 1992. And what's really sad is that when I first got there, there was Palestinian. I was in Tel Aviv. There was Palestinians everywhere. They worked. We got along. There wasn't. I wouldn't say that the Palestinians were treated as first-class citizens. They weren't. But they were there. They were able. Everybody got along. And it has just got there. You don't even hardly see it. You won't see a Palestinian at all. You'll see an Arab Israeli. And that's another aspect to this conflict, by the way, which is the Arab Israeli populace, who are Israeli citizens, have all the rights and rights of citizenship, but they're not treated the same, and that's also not good for. I actually, you guys may have read. I didn't put it in my bio here, but I was doing a study abroad to both Israel and Palestine, and we were actually going to look at, there's not just Palestinians, there's Druze, there's Bedouin, there's the Baha'i, there's all these different groups, and actually that was going to be, unfortunately, COVID came around, but that was going to be the objective of this trip, was to meet those people and understand the difficulties that they're going through as a result of this conflict. So. Yeah, to answer your question, I'm not sure what it looks like now, Michael. It's tough. It's tough to see, at least in the short term. I'm just mostly concerned. I am concerned that the more and more settlements that are built, the more and more that Israel just goes on the offensive, and complicating this is the larger regional structure. Right. And so just like this current government had lost patience with the Palestinians, so did the Arab governments. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Abraham Accords. Are we? I don't know. Anyway, so it's an agreement between Israel. These are all former enemies of Israel, and they made peace with Israel for pragmatic, economic, technological reasons. And the Palestinians, that just pushes the whole Palestinian issue almost off the map. And again, not to be pessimistic, but I wrote a paper about kind of a discourse logic of terrorism. And I went back and I reread that model. I wrote this like 10 years ago. And I could not help but to conclude that it makes absolute sense for Palestinians to re-engage in violent terrorism. Because they've lost their audience, right? And that's largely how Palestinian terrorism was used, was to gain an audience, to get international sympathy. And they've kind of lost it. And so my model would predict that that's what they're gonna do. That's what they should do if they want to get back on the map. And it just seems like the world has mostly forgot about them and moved on. And that just inevitably leads to, so it's the situation in Israel and Palestine is already called apartheid. It actually isn't, just because it's not technically it's not. I mean, Palestinians are just not, they can vote, they have their own elections, they can do their own thing. But if you become a one-state solution, then that's what you end up with, apartheid. So sorry if that wasn't the most positive of answers, but I'm just,
I actually want to follow up that. I mean, I've got another question to ask before our time is up, but I actually want Jon to respond to what you said, just based on his experience with using violence before, nonviolence. Obviously he has experience in this, so he would be the best to speak to this. What do you say to this, Jon?
Well, I mean, first of all, we talk about a two-state solution. I mean, what you have to remember, in 1922, Ireland became the two-state solution.
Yeah.
The establishment of the state of the North, and the rules that came with that to enable, actually to prevent the British having to deal with Northern loyalists, was the start of a two-state solution. Alongside that, the fact that as the state was created, it was created on a false premise. It was created to sustain that it would have, for at least 5 generations, a sustainable unionist majority. They built that at the outset, thinking that's the way it's going to be. 150 years from now, we're still going to be a majority. And that's my problem when I look at a two-state solution, is when does the time come around when people can say, we might have outguessed this, we need to go back and look at it. And once it's signed, the whole thing is that once the accord is signed, then that's it, it's written in stone. It's the 10 commandments, it can't be changed. I'm saying, no, you need to go back and revisit this stuff as we go through it. Because as the state of the North of Ireland was created, with its built-in unionist majority, it came along with a package that ensured that majority would have ultimate power. That meant denying people the right to vote. It meant, thank you very much to the great, to the United States for the system of gerrymandering that we inherited. It allowed local council to draw divisional boundaries where they could control housing, and by controlling housing, you control voting. I live in a city that since 1922 has at least had a 70% Catholic majority. Between 1922 and 1972, the Catholic or nationalist majority never had a majority on the city council because of the system of gerrymandering. The city is divided into 3 electoral wards. The North Ward, the business community, predominantly business unionists and unionist Catholics, voted unionists. They elected 8 representatives. The South Ward, 14,000 people living in desperate housing conditions, one on top of the other, literally living out of one another's pockets. 14,000 people in a voting register went out to elect 8 members of council. They elected 8 unionists. Now we have a tied council. But on the East Ward in the Waterside, with 4,500 people on the voting register in 1969 or 1959, they elected 4 unionists. So we had a council for 50 years that had 12 unionists and 8 nationalists on it. There's no problem with the council doing the job of council or corporation. Local city councils doing what they do. They bury the dead, they sweep the streets, they look after the parks, all of that. But when they also have the authority and the money to build public housing and decide not to do it, because to give somebody a house means to give them a vote, and they decide not to do that. That's why a guy like me ended up spending 10 years in a children's home. And I've just spent the last 14 years of my life creating a redress process for people that were in children's homes along with me, I learned how to take on a government. I learned that the force of argument is greater than the argument of force. And it took a long time, and it took the deaths of 3,600 people. And when we look at the scale of that, 3,600, you are losing more than that in a couple of months in the States to gun violence. We're talking about a 30-year conflict where over 3,500 people died, and suddenly we're like the pity factor of the world. I'm saying, yes, we've lost people. But guys, if we're going to start talking to us about creating peace, take a look at what you're not doing to create peace on your streets. And one of the other issues, and Martin sort of touched on it very briefly, it wasn't just about Israelis and Palestinians. It's about the external influence as well. It's about Syria. It's about America. It's about Iraq. It's about Iran. It's about Kuwait. It's about the Arab Emirates. It's about everybody that has a vested interest in ensuring that what they can get out of this conflict, or what they can put into this conflict, they're going to get a reward from. I mean, our problem was that there was no benefit to anybody from our conflict. We lost 3,600, just over 3,600 people. Nobody needed to die to get a house, to get a vote, and ensure that they weren't discriminated against in employment. That's what we're talking about. This was not a conflict over the reunification of this island. This was not a conflict over maintaining the link with Britain. This was a conflict that started in the same way as Martin Luther King marched from Selma, looking for the right to vote, looking for the right to be respected, looking for the right to be identified as a human being. That's what this conflict was about. It transformed into something else because of the force that the state used to suppress the argument that we were saying. And the argument we were saying, if we can peacefully get houses, if we can peacefully get jobs, if we can peacefully get a vote, let's do it. But by denying the right to vote and the opportunity to be able to make that change, this war created itself and created a different dynamic that ended up with a demand for United Ireland and a demand for the maintenance of the link with the United Kingdom. This was never a war about either of those things. And for me, this was never a religious war. I hated when people describe this as a religious conflict. It never was. This was a class conflict. How I know that? I was at college with people who lived in the only exclusively Protestant neighborhood left on the west bank of the River Fall. We were talking about bad housing conditions. These people were living in worse housing conditions than we were living in. This was about class. It was never about religion. Religion became a convenient tie for people to hang this on. And I think when we go back and we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're going to find the same thing. If we start looking at it as the impact on the lives of people rather than the faith that they express, we're going to see it in a different way. We just need to have to look at this thing in a different way.
Yeah, these seem to be tribal conflicts much more so than they are oftentimes religious conflicts, tribal conflicts over space and power.
Make a comment there. I want to add a level of complexity that so everybody kind of really understands what has happened, especially since the Camp David Accords. As John was saying, it's not the conflict. First of all, it's not about religion. Religion's a convenient justification, but it's really not. And John, as I mentioned before, there's external actors, as John brought up again, right? We have Europe, we have America, we have the regional powers. Of course, they all have interest. But I think what people fail to realize, especially in the last 10 years would be actually 10 or 15 years, this is a lot of what happens in Palestine is Israeli occupation, as John was talking about, housing and stuff. Israel will, take away land and And, it does go through the courts, and actually the Israeli Supreme Court is actually a decent court. And that's why there's such a mess in Israel right now, because they want to dismantle that court, because they don't want that court standing in their way of taking more land. That's exactly what's happening. But I want to bring up there's an added level of complexity that most people are missing. The fight right now has more to do with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the PLO, the Fatah party. Okay, it has more to do with them than it does Israel. Israel's not going anywhere. Okay, there was hope in the 60s that we could push Israel out. There was hope. There was a possibility. It was a real possibility. That's mostly gone. Right now, there was a civil war in 2000, a Palestinian civil war in 2007, and these characters have been at it ever since. And the problem from Israel's side is because the way to gain popular Palestinian support is to inflict more and more pain on Israelis. Who can inflict the most pain? Who's really defending the Palestinian cause? And so Israel in this situation, so I just want to explain that, is kind of sitting in the middle of what to do. And like I said, this current government has given up altogether, which is, just makes it worse. Now, I'm not saying I don't want to dismiss Israel's actions in the West Bank, though. I don't, Israel in 2005 left Gaza, I think 2005, 2004, left Gaza. Gaza is its own, that's their attitude. It's their own problem. And we talk about it being a prison, and Israelis would come back and say, well, there's Egypt, that's just the narratives. But yeah, I think that, I just wanted to add that level, though, that it's this conflict currently in its current state between the Palestinians is between the Palestinians. And I certainly don't think that Israel is doing anything to make that better. In fact, like I said, the current government is doing everything to make it worse. So you'll see, just to give you an example, and if you watch the news, you'll see Israeli soldiers will on a Friday go and remove people praying at the mosque because whatever. And that sparks violence, right? So it gives the parties a reason to participate in this. So yeah, I just wanted to make it more complex. So
I take your point. The difficulty is that if the solution, and what I'm reading into what you're saying is, one of the phrases you used there was there's always Egypt, In other words, leave. And part of that,
no, it's not leave. No, it's John. It wasn't. No, it's not. I just want to correct. It's not leave. It's the argument is that Israel, and in fact, kind of does. It's sealed it off. It sealed Gaza off. It does supply water. It does supply food. But in the international media, this was portrayed as a prison. And the Israelis would argue, well, you can get supplies from Egypt too. We're not the only source. I think is the point.
Yeah. Okay, Martin. I want to come back on one thing that I know, and I know personally, because friends of mine here in Derry, and again, that thing about support for the Palestinians. I can tell you there is no greater voice for the Palestinians than Irish Republicans.
Yeah.
We've been involved in a war. We've fought a war. We know what it costs. And we're talking about post-ceasefire, post-Good Friday Agreement. In the middle of the 2000 and 2010, friends of mine, former Republican prisoners, got together, bought an ambulance, filled it with supplies, put it on a boat. We're taking it to Israel.
Yeah.
And the boat was attacked by helicopters. And 2 people were killed on the boat. And on that boat was Mairead Corrigan, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, was on that boat when it was attacked.
Yeah.
And we're saying we're open for relief. Let's find some, the thing is it's about accommodation. It's about, if we're talking about relief, you can't dictate the type of relief that we're going to send. We're sending food, we're sending medicine, we're sending clothes for children, whatever it is that people need. We're not going to send cement so that you can build. We're not going to send, fertilizer so he can make bombs instead of plants. You know, we know how to do all this stuff. So part of it is like, where does the accommodation come where it says, you know, the international community has a responsibility. It has to be held up as being responsible for offering what relief it possibly can to the people of Israel, but not, you know, at the same time recognizing that Israel loses people on a daily basis. And I think part of this is, where is the point of accommodation that we need to be meeting? You know, and at this point, there isn't a point of accommodation. And we need to create that.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there is actually agreements now and stuff. Goods coming in are handled through Israeli authorities and it's inspected. And I think what you're talking though is in the wake of, it was either in the lead up or the wake of 2014, where Israel was very paranoid about all this. They discovered the tunnels and you know. I'm not making any excuses for the Israeli government. I'm just saying that's their attitude. You know, that's all I can to Israelis. It's hard, you know, it's hard now because I have to say, well, I have to qualify it and say, well, 5 years ago. So I'm just going to go with 5 years ago. To Israelis, first of all, Hamas is the enemy, right? The Israelis were perfectly willing, and I think still are perfectly willing to work with Fatah and the PLO, and in fact support them and try to prop them up. But I think where the roadblock is the lack of accommodation with Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. That's
I would agree with you there. You know, part of that is like, I mean, is there a way, and we have to do this, that we can remove the external actors from this and lead the solution to the people who are not just going to be affected and are being affected on a daily basis, but by the people who will inherit whatever's created from it and what that needs. You know, and unfortunately, particularly in the Middle East, you know, what it means is other external agencies getting involved to start taking out the leadership of Hamas, which is just going to leave, a regime that the control over which nobody has. And I think that's the bigger fear. Right now, there's an understanding of the power of Hamas. There's an understanding of the power of some of the other, and I hate to use the word, but I have to use the word, terrorist groups that show themselves as having a vested interest in maintaining the Palestinian conflict. And as soon as you act against them, suddenly you could take out leadership that at some point has some type of control. To lead something without any leadership and no control at all. And again, you know, this means that Camp David didn't do it. You know, any of the other accords didn't do it. That you need to be going, and much as it goes, I mean, I remember somebody saying to me, John, but would you sit in a room with ISIS? 10 years ago, I would not have. Today, I wouldn't have a problem doing it.
Yeah.
Because I can see there's room for transformation there.
There's something really interesting in what you say, and I teach students this all the time. I mean, you know, the original outburst of, I mean, there was always violence, but the outburst of violence in the wake of or in the buildup actually to the Camp David Accords. What I came to understand, we began this conversation and I said, well, when I got bombed, I wanted to understand them. And one of the first things that I came to understand is and this is Hamas, they didn't have a seat at the table. You were talking to PLO, right? But you weren't talking, I mean, that's still the problem. And Israel refuses to talk to Hamas, but cooperates with the PLO. And that, again, brings these inter-Palestinian tensions. But one more thing I would say, though, is in going back, you know, when I worked for Peace, Search for Common Ground, I said we went to Turkey and we mediated an agreement for these countries to work together. We did include Gazans. So there was Palestinians from Gaza and there was Palestinians from the West Bank and Jordanians and Egyptians and Israelis. And we were able to, again, force of argument, we were able to demonstrate to them that it was actually in their interest to create this collaborative project. Yeah.
All right.
And just before we go back to you, I know you're pushed for time. I will say that I have met and I've worked with people who've been involved in Search for Common Ground here. They actually they used to do a regular visit to the Corrymeela community in Ballycastle. So I mean, there's quite a few of the people that were involved with Search for Common Ground that I'm familiar with.
I got a couple student questions, participant questions that I'd like to ask of you in the chat. One of them is from one of my colleagues up in Greeley, Mr. McCourt. How do you suggest people of Northern Ireland celebrate their history without offending the people of Ireland itself? And I would assume this is a question addressing both Republican and Loyalist communities. Yeah.
And again, I mean, to the world outside, when we talk about Ireland, I'm talking about the whole Ireland, and the world now has got this geographic sort of idea that Ireland is the bit on the other side of the border, 3 miles from my home, and this is the north. This is part of the United Kingdom. And I think part of it is, like, we reached accommodation on marching in this city. We need to be able to look at where the other issues are. And what we're dealing with now are the consequences of conflict. And if we're not, one of the things over the years I've figured out is you cannot deal with the consequences of conflict unless you're prepared to deal with the causes of conflict. And dealing with the causes of conflict means to get into the skin of the guy on the other side of the table and find out what drives him. Where is his passion? Where's his belief? What means most to him? And if that's about a flag, then let's talk about a flag. If it's about a right to march, let's talk about a right to march. But if we're talking about a right to march, let's talk about an accommodation that says I have no difficulty at all as an Irish Republican saying you can celebrate your history and your culture, as long as it doesn't impede on my right as a citizen to walk where I want to walk. I don't want to have to go through 2,000 soldiers to get to a grocery store just because you're holding a march. And one of the greatest examples of that, and in fact, I was challenged with it yesterday, Michelle O'Neill, who is the First Minister in waiting at the Northern Ireland Assembly, is going to the coronation. And the challenges that holds for Republicans, and the challenges that holds particularly for the city, because the new king is the honorary colonel-in-chief of the parachute regiment who were responsible for the murder of 14 people on the streets of this city. And I was right in the middle of it when it happened. Unfortunately, the people who challenged me weren't old enough to remember this. And they're saying she shouldn't be going, she's betraying us. I'm saying, if you're talking about betrayal, think back 6 years to the handshake between Martin McGuinness and Queen Elizabeth. And the Queen lost her uncle, and she was still prepared to walk into that corridor and shake hands with Martin McGuinness as the elected representative of nationalism in the North, of republicanism in the North, as a former commander of the Irish Republican Army, and shake his hand as an act of reconciliation. And I'm saying Michelle O'Neill views this as the ultimate act of reconciliation. And you know the great thing about reconciliation? It doesn't demand that the other party apologize. That's our problem here. We can't move beyond the place where we are because we're always waiting for the other guy to put his hand up. And I'm saying we don't have to wait for the other guy to put his hand up. We can extend the hand in friendship and the hand in reconciliation, recognizing what you've done, but also recognizing how far we have moved from that.
The other question that I have is directed, and thank you very much for that answer. What a great answer that was. And how fortunate we are to have you with us today. This has been a great privilege for me, for myself, especially given my my area of expertise, the fact that I've lived in Belfast, the fact that I've traveled all over the north. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. I love Derry. You know, my wife and I visited before the Good Friday Agreement. We thought it was a great city even back then. It reminds me a lot of where I am from in Birmingham, Alabama. Just the dynamics are just a little bit different. So this has been a great pleasure. I know people have places to be. I know it's 3:15, but I do have a couple of more student questions if you do have time.
Any of you guys have questions? Just want to, okay, go ahead.
All right, so this is from Jen. Sounds like Jen is in Berlin right now, and it's in the middle of the night. Thanks for being with us, Jen. Have either of you, Martin and Jon, employed any of Gene Sharp's 198 ways of nonviolent means in your experience? Let's see. Eric Chenoweth, Maria Stevens made it very clear in their data collected from 1900 to 2006 that most productive and effective ways are through nonviolence. That being said, how do you both get parties to the table to even start peace talks when violence is all around us? Great freaking question.
I can answer that question from the Palestinian perspective. It was in their interest. So I'm just going to do a real quick recap here of history, but I'll start with there was the 67 war. The Palestinians more or less lost faith in the Arab world. I mean, the Arabs lost badly. And so the Palestinians decide to go on their own. In the course, they end up in southern Lebanon. And they're taking pot shots on Israel, but that wasn't really it. There was a civil war that broke out. Because of that civil war, long story short, they are exiled to Tunisia. Okay. This is in 1980s. This is also around, so it's before the time, but we have the Gulf War. Cold War's over, Gulf War, kind of world unites, and we come together at Madrid to try to resolve this conflict. Most people don't know this, but when the Palestinians were exiled, when the PLO was exiled to Tunisia, it was the United States and Israel who set up Hamas to fill the political vacuum, believe in it being a religious group and it would be nonviolent. That turned out to be not to be the case. And in 1987, the Intifada broke out. A couple of years later, we have Madrid. And in this case, the PLO was left out of the loop. Okay, they had no recourse of terrorism because they're exiled. They have no voice. And Madrid and then also gave them that chance to get back in. So, I can't say that was, planned out, but that's what happened. Thank you. So, that is, it was pure self-interest. They were going to be discarded to history. So.
Okay,
I'm not sure that's very helpful about how to get them to the table, but.
You actually reminded me of something when you talked about the first Intifada. I was in Jerusalem probably 12, 14 years ago. And I met a guy called David Barenbaum. I think that's his name. And he has an orchestra. And the orchestra is like amazing. It's made up of both Israelis and Palestinians. And the guy who played second fiddle in that orchestra showed me a photograph of himself as a 9-year-old boy with a rock in his hand, prepared to throw this rock at an Israeli soldier for which he could possibly have been shot dead.
Yeah.
And I remember we had the City of Culture here in Derry in 2013, and part of the hope was that we would give young people a different version of a future. And what it needed was something like that, the guy that ran that orchestra, to step in there and take the stones out of young people's hands and put instruments in their hands and get them to work alongside people. Because if we're not going to do that, if we're continually going to deal with the consequences of conflict, we're not going to deal with the causes, and we're just creating more bumps further down the road. And I mean, for me, I say, look, there's absolutely nothing wrong in this city right now that could wipe out the dissident IRA, the real IRA, the other IRAs. Good God, we have that many IRAs now. I just don't know who's who. But what we need is to create a different future for our young people. And there's nothing wrong in this city right now that 25,000 jobs wouldn't fix. One of the things I found, and I've worked with a lot of prisoners, I've been a former political prisoner myself, and one of the things you find among the majority of political prisoners is they're unemployed when they become involved in the conflict. So we find another way of doing this, and we create a political avenue that allows expression for nationalism, for unionism, for whatever your political choice is going to be. And we do that without opening an avenue that said violence is going to achieve something. Then we have a future. But it means investment in a different sort of way. And I just want to talk just 1 second about a particular investment. 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. The SDLP went around the world, and John Hume, to be fair, went around the world looking to get inward investment into the north. And he got Seagate, a company that employed 3,000 people in Derry, a massive economic boost. But he also got Raytheon. And then we realized what Raytheon were. Raytheon are the company that make the guidance system for cruise missiles. And we got Raytheon as part of our peace dividend. No, if we're going to get investment, we need to have ethical investment. We need to create a place where young people are going to understand that what they're involved in and what they're employed in isn't just about changing their life and their world. It's about changing the bigger world.
John, I would just have a real.
And I think what we're missing in that.
I just have a real quick inquiry about that, because in Israel there's been there's an understanding of that, and companies have opened up and provided jobs, and good jobs, to Palestinians. But was there any backlash in the community? Because that's one of the things that Palestinians face if they go work for an Israeli company, for example.
Oh yeah, there was certainly backlash against Raytheon after 3 years having a place here where they, I mean, they got massive support from the Industrial Development Board so they could come here. They got a factory free of rates and free of expenses for 5 years. And 3 years into it, when people realized what Raytheon was, direct action actually meant computers being thrown out of the window of Raytheon's office and Raytheon deciding we don't belong in Derry. I mean, I think we should have made that choice right at the very start, that they didn't belong in Derry.
Yeah.
All right. I have one more question. We haven't forgot about you, Esther. This is a question. Thanks, Esther, for joining us today. Esther has a question directed at Martin, and the question is she says is relevant to Israel and Palestine as well. Is there any way for Israelis to celebrate their history, for example? And Esther, even though I worked in Judaic studies in grad school, my pronunciation is still not great. And even though one of my mentors was a German Jew and spoke Hebrew to me all the time, can you help me? Yom Hazmaut?
Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Yom Hazmaut. Yeah. And the accent doesn't help either. I know that. For example, on Yom Hazmaut, while recognizing the way Palestinians feel about this day as the beginning of Nakba, And Esther, I might ask you to tell me, since I don't know what y'all's husband, maybe you can tell me what that is.
It was yesterday.
And then and then Martin can answer the question.
Of course, and I'm so sorry. I've only got like 2 minutes before my students come back. But Yom Ha'atzmaut is Israel's Independence Day, and it's also viewed by Palestinians as the beginning of the Nakba, beginning of this like terrible destruction of their homes, their properties being forced out, and it feels like this paradigm of it's I don't know. I'm it's just very complex of a day. There's a lot of feelings that are associated with it, and it seems like you can only be one way or the other. You can only sort of have both of those things. So that's my question.
Esther, is the question, is there a way that both can celebrate, or how Israelis can celebrate in light of Al-Nakba?
Yeah, maybe.
I mean,
is it okay to express one view, one community, one nationalism without upsetting the other one? Is that what you're asking, Esther?
Yeah,
yes, as an Israeli Jew, I do celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, and at the same time, I, have spent a lot of time studying, the Middle Eastern studies, the Palestinian conflict, all these things, and just recognizing how Palestinians feel and going into that day with some, I don't know, a way to approach the situation with a little bit more mindfulness rather than just being like, go Israel, or oh, this is a horrible day, because, my family was able to find refuge in Israel. My grandmother was able to find a safe place after the Holocaust. So it's this sort of, it feels like impossible. And I don't know if Martin can shed any light on that.
So it's tough. First of all, let's define Al-Nakba is the great catastrophe. So that's the catastrophe that befell the Palestinians when they lost the Israeli War of Independence. So it's, so for one group of people, this is a celebration. For the other, this is the most horrible thing that could happen. So, and the way Yom Ha'atzmaut is celebrated is Israeli jets and Israeli helicopters and all kinds of stuff and ships and they go all through the country and do flyovers. And so it's really, that's maybe one way, Esther, that maybe there shouldn't be this military bravado for such a celebration. I mean, that if Israelis want to light off fireworks on their Independence Day, so be it, they should. Does it need to be in the face when I think that the one thing that you could do, I mean, you have Israeli jets, so they do fly all over the country. They make sure that anybody in the country, it would take them, I just read the article yesterday, it would take them no more than 20 minutes to get to, they do demonstrations, right? They do little air shows and whatever. I guess one way was, I mean, first you could stop celebrating that way. But if you're going to do that, just a second, but if you're going to do that, make sure you're not flying over Palestinian villages and towns, and that's kind of rubbing it in their face. So, but can we come with something that's actually where we can come out and celebrate together? I think, from the Arab Israeli population, that might be possible. There is a way to celebrate the state of Israel from many Arab Israelis. I wouldn't say all, but many. For the Palestinians, I think I think certainly not showing that kind of bravado flying over their towns in Israeli jets is not something that,
right. Maybe I'm thinking more from like an Israeli perspective, how to sort of incorporate some of this, recognizing the history behind it while also celebrating. Like, is that even possible?
Yeah, and there is no, I would say there is. I mean, there is attempts. John was talking about taking the stone out of the kid's hand, and there have been attempts to do educational reform in the Israeli Arab communities. I'm not going to talk about Palestinians on this, and to build the kind of sense of common identity. And that's really the path forward. Is if we can all see that we're part of the same project, and make it real. I mean, I think when I was going to do the study abroad, and I went to go set it all up, And I knew this existed, but I'd go to Arab Israeli towns and realize the frustrations and why they're feeling these frustrations. It's not that all of them hate the state of Israel. They just wish that either Israel would leave them alone, but would also pay attention to them in the sense of funding for hospitals, for schools, for roads, right? Get the same kind of treatment that every Israeli citizen gets. They're Israelis. Why shouldn't they have the same good roads, right? And so I think that's John. I think John had something to say.
Yeah, Esther, again, I come back to something that I said earlier, which is, and we look at the two avenues that are opened here. One is the avenue of celebration, the other is the avenue of commemoration.
Yeah.
And for Palestinians, this would be something that is a commemoration. It's about loss. And I'm sitting here and I have this image because I was I was actually in when I was in Jordan in, again, 2012 or something. And I met this old woman, and she would have been probably as old as my mother would have been when I left home, probably 70 years, when I left Derry, 70 years of age. And she put her hand in her pocket. She didn't have to go looking around the house, and she didn't have to go searching through her handbag. She put her hand in her pocket and she took out 2 keys. Keys that she'd had for 60 years. Where do those keys go back to the door that they belong in? Where's the accommodation going to be reached that allows somebody? And I have this thing because I've been involved with the historical institutional abuse campaign here in the north. And one of the things that I insisted on was that the children who were stolen from here, who were taken to Australia, have to have the right and the opportunity and the funding to come back and put their hand on their own earth. And for the Irish, land is important. Putting your hand on your own ground is important. And for me, I can't help but believe that the Palestinians feel the same thing. That this is about being able to put your hand back on your own earth. And where can we reach the accommodation between commemoration and celebration that says, this isn't about being triumphalist over you. This is a part of our history that we have pride in. And on the other side, it's not just about the disaster that it was. It's about, at some point, finding a place where we can accommodate the wishes of people who want to end up putting their hand on their own earth, just if not for themselves, for their children or for their grandchildren. For me, I'm Irish. I don't care where in the world I go, I'm always going to be Irish, and I want to end up back here. And I can't help but think that, that anybody from any other nation has that same tie to where they're from. And I think, flyovers aren't a great way of demonstrating, that we sort of understand that, we beat you, but we want you to understand it as well. That's why we've had such a battle over flags and marches and everything else. But we find space to accommodate that,
But it's still hard, because at the core, Esther, in Northern Ireland, at the core, loyalists are celebrating their overlordship over the Catholic population. So that there's always that issue at hand, at least in Northern Ireland. The base of this is William III, the conquest, the civil and religious liberties nonsense, all of that kind of stuff, colors the perspective. But like John said, there's been concessions. So each community tries their best not to go out of their way to be offended and let each other do their thing to a point. So it looks like we the professors are left. I really appreciate, again, this opportunity. I have 2 innocent questions I need to ask John before I leave. And one of them is, do you like Derry Girls? And if so, who's your favorite character?
Absolutely amazing. I love it. And Orla is my favorite character. Orla is just like off the wall. And I love Michelle. I have a daughter just like Michelle. I have a daughter just like Claire. I have 6 sons. I have 3 daughters. So I've been through all of this. And Derry, yes, honestly, I think, I mean, for a way of showing people what this city is, it's done an amazing job. Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant,
I haven't seen the mural yet, but we're gonna go next summer and check out the mural in your city. I can't wait to come. I can't wait to go back. My other and so
well, get in touch with me. Get in touch with me, and I'll take you around the walls, and I'll take you through the bogside, and I'll. By the time you're finished, you will have both laughed and cried.
That sounds great. My other question, and this is an innocent question, mind you, who's going to win the Old Firm this weekend?
I have absolutely no interest in soccer at all. Not a
Really?
time of interest have I. I would be more interested. In fact, I'm quite annoyed that Monaghan beat Derry yesterday, and I'd rather see Ireland win everything in the rugby. And I don't care what it is or who they're playing against. I don't care. But I have absolutely no interest in soccer at all.
I'm a huge soccer fan.
But I go to the Brandywell 4 or 5 times a year. Not that I have an interest in soccer, but I have friends who do, and I just love the banter. I love the shouting and the roaring and 22 grown men kicking a bit of a cow around a bit of grass. Hey, why not?
I watch every single Rangers game. I've got a picture of myself in the bogside next to the Celtic mural, at that pub down there. And I don't know if it's still there anymore. I love SPL. I fell in love with it, when I was living in Glasgow and Belfast.
If you think about it, I mean, there's Manchester City and Manchester United playing one of those other cup things, right? And if you took the total pot of money that was invested in those two teams, it's the budget of a small country.
It really is.
And these are guys kicking a bit of a cow around a bit of grass,
It really
frustrated me. Like, seriously frustrated me. Like, how this city shut down when Manchester was playing just a couple of weeks ago. I couldn't even go in and get a beer.
Champions League, baby. I mean, Champions League. That's huge.
I was so mad. I couldn't go into any bar because it was literally, as my dad would say, nut to butt everywhere. Like, you couldn't move in any of the bars, and I was just so frustrated. So
I still play myself. I coach my son's 12-year-old team. The only reason I didn't come down to Denver today is because I got to coach the 12-year-olds this afternoon. But a frivolous question. I have more Celtic supporter friends than I have Rangers supporter friends. So I just loved it. The whole, like you say, the banter, the history. I'm going to get texts this weekend from Glasgow of everybody calling me all the names. It's fun stuff.
I got yelled at because I
just bear with me.
Don't
shut it down 1 second. Just don't shut that down 1 second.
Martin, you've opened a can of worms getting me together with this guy.
I did. I actually want to go visit Ireland with both of you, and
it's amazing. It's like going to Alabama, to be honest with you. It's like going to Tennessee. It's but they have different accents.
Now I don't want to go.
Oh. Look at this.
Love the hat.
Yes.
I care a lot more about jazz than I do about soccer.
And it's nice and blue too.
That's something I can get down with.
I have another
I'm gonna keep
for tomorrow, and I have 2 suits for Saturday, and I have another suit for Sunday.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's fantastic. You know what? I hope you remember my name, because like I say, next time I'm in the north, I am definitely going to look you up. This has been a pleasure.
And if you can't make it for the jazz festival, the only other time to get here is Halloween. We have the largest Halloween carnival in Europe.
Right. That's right. I knew that. That's true. I knew that. That sounds like, and it looks like it's really, really fun. See, those are those